It was just after 13 Ormer at the Sierra Valley shooting complex. Sunlight filtered through the cloudless sky, glinting off rifle barrels lined up on concrete benches. A dozen cadets from the Air Force ROTC program had been rotating through lanes, checking their targets at 200 yards and logging groupings in spiral-bound notebooks. It was routine training, full of youthful confidence and the kind of casual chatter that filled the space between magazine reloads. From the corner entrance, a figure appeared middle-aged, denim jacket, worn boots, soft brown hair tied loosely behind her neck. She carried a soft rifle case by the handle, no range bag, no team patch, and definitely no Air Force blues. Someone near Lane 8 whispered just loud enough, "Is she lost or something?" Another cadet laughed, saying maybe she was here to get her grandson's autograph. A third suggested she was probably looking for the gift shop. Nobody bothered to hide the smirks. She walked slowly, deliberately, heading toward the sign-in kiosk near the range officer's station. One of the juniors leaned toward his friend and muttered, "She's probably here for a selfie with the Jets." That joke got more laughs than it should have. The irony was, nobody in that group realized there were no Jets here. Just wind, rifles, and targets. But mocking someone felt easier than noticing the grip on her case or how balanced her steps were on the gravel. The range officer, Sergeant Willis, barely looked up as she gave her reservation confirmation. Lane 6, reserved for civilian use, approved by command 2 days earlier. He glanced at the paper, nodded, and pointed to the far left end of the firing line. Her path to that lane took her directly past 4 cadets hunched over ballistic calculators, arguing over MOA versus MIL adjustments. One of them rolled his eyes and muttered something about tourists with scopes. She didn't blink, just kept walking. Lane 6 was isolated, sandwiched between the ROTC group and a concrete barrier used for windbreaks. She laid her rifle case gently on the bench, unzipped it, and revealed a Remington 700 with a fluted heavy barrel and a Vortex razor scope already mounted. There were no flashy colors or aftermarket gimmicks, just clean, well-oiled steel and walnut. She pulled a folded cloth from her jacket pocket and began wiping down the bolt. By now, a few heads had turned. A couple cadets paused their target analysis to watch. It wasn't what she did. It was how she moved. Precise. Quiet. One cadet nudged another. "She's not wearing ear pro yet. Maybe she doesn't know how this works." That got another chuckle. But she wasn't flustered. She was focused, adjusting the rifle rest, calibrating her position against the shooting bench like she'd done it 1,000 times before. Nobody knew her name. Nobody asked. They only saw a woman in her 50s, alone, wearing civilian clothes, with a rifle that looked too clean to have seen action. They didn't know about the patches she never wore, or the missions she'd flown, or the call signs that had faded with time. By 1310, the laughs had faded to whispers. Something about her unsettled the rhythm of the range. She hadn't said a word, but the way she leveled that rifle, the way she steadied her breathing as she adjusted the rear bag, it made them stop pretending. For the first time all afternoon, the cadets weren't focused on each other. They were watching her, and none of them had any idea who she really was. At 13:12, Captain Mitchell noticed the shift in posture along the firing line. It wasn't anything dramatic, just small breaks in cadence. A few cadets had stopped adjusting their scopes. One leaned on his elbow, pretending to clean his rifle while watching Lane 6. Mitchell followed their gaze and saw the woman, civilian, mid-50s maybe. No unit insignia, no ID badge on display. Her movements were clean, though she wasn't fumbling with gear or asking for range instructions. That alone was unusual enough. He stepped out from behind the observation post, walking slowly along the concrete path that divided the firing bays. His boots struck in rhythm with the chatter of gunfire. When he reached the midpoint, he paused to speak with Lt. Rayner, one of the more confident cadets in the current rotation. Rayner leaned close, just enough to be heard over the steady percussion of rifles around them. Said something about a civilian wandering in during a qualification day. Mitchell nodded once, then kept walking. He wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but range protocols existed for a reason. As he neared the far left bay, he saw her adjusting her shooting mat. Nothing fancy, just a well-used foam pad rolled out with care. Her rifle was already set on a bipod, muzzle forward, bolt open. She was checking windage on her scope, not with a range flag or handheld meter, but with a folded wind card and the angle of dust drifting across the field. Leet. Rayner followed close behind, clearly seeing this as a chance to assert himself. He stopped just outside the yellow safety line and raised his voice slightly. "Ma'am, just a heads up. These lanes are set up for long-range grouping. You may want to zero first on the 50-yard targets. It'll be a lot easier." He smiled like he was being helpful, but his tone carried a smug undercurrent, like he was offering life advice to a tourist. She didn't look up, just made a small adjustment to her rear sandbag, shifting it half an inch. Then she checked the torque on her scope rings using a preset tool, confirming consistent pressure without overcranking. The kind of thing nobody teaches unless you've been burned by loose glass on a live op. Rayner waited a beat longer, expecting acknowledgement. When she didn't respond, he chuckled and stepped back. Mitchell watched her for another few seconds. He wasn't ready to say anything, but something about her setup didn't match the assumptions being thrown around. At 13:18, Maggie began loading her magazine. She wasn't using cheap reloads or plinking ammo. Each round came from a labeled case, match grade, .308 hand-seated. She ran her fingers along each case before inserting it, checking for any inconsistency by feel. Muscle memory guided every motion. Mitchell finally stepped closer. He kept his voice steady. "Ma'am, just confirming you're qualified for this range. Some of these lanes are set for qualification standards." She looked up briefly, gave a single nod, then returned to aligning her stock against her shoulder. Her posture was correct. No wasted movement. No hesitation. She called no range officer, asked no questions, and didn't look confused. In fact, she appeared more composed than half the cadets under his command. Mitchell narrowed his eyes slightly. The Remington she held wasn't a basic civilian setup. It had been custom-fitted, cheek rest, adjustable LOP, suppressed barrel thread, nothing too flashy, but unmistakably built by someone who knew exactly what they needed and nothing they didn't. Lot. Rayner leaned in again, voice still light. "You might want to brace for that first shot. These distances catch a lot of folks off guard." She finally spoke, calm and even. "I'll be fine. No eye roll, no sarcasm, just fact." That answer hung in the air longer than expected. Mitchell stood silent for a moment longer, then gave a short nod and turned back toward his station. He didn't say what he was thinking, but the question had already formed. Who the hell is she? Back on lane 6. Maggie adjusted the elevation knob with 2 fingers, rotated the windage 3 clicks right, then settled in behind the scope. Her breathing was already steady, heart rate low. From a distance, she looked like any other quiet shooter. But everything about her preparation said otherwise. By 13:23, the air had changed again. Less talking now, fewer jokes. And for the first time that afternoon, several cadets were watching her not out of mockery, but out of curiosity they couldn't explain. At 13:25, the air along the Sierra Valley range held still. Maggie had finished her adjustments, her scope now dialed in with the kind of precision that didn't rely on guesswork. She slid the bolt forward, chambering the first round. Then she exhaled slowly, letting the breath settle her body into stillness. Her trigger finger rested softly against the curve of the shoe. No tension, no strain, just waiting for the heartbeat to drop. The shot broke clean. A sharp crack cut through the layered noise of semi-autos and standard-issue rifles. It was a different tone, lower and sharper, like something slicing through fabric instead of hammering steel. A few heads turned, more out of instinct than intention. Maggie didn't move. She adjusted her cheek weld slightly, reset her breath, and sent another round. Second shot, same sound, same stillness. By the third, even Mitchell glanced toward lane 6. The reports were too evenly spaced, too calm. He'd heard that pattern before, but not often. Maggie sent the fourth, then the fifth, each precisely timed. No wasted seconds, no visible shift in posture. Every motion flowed like a practiced drill, and then it stopped. She raised her head slowly and cleared the chamber. By 13:27, silence followed her 5 shots like a shadow. Rayner, still leaning against a spotting scope, blinked hard and muttered, Is that one hole?" Mitchell stepped forward without a word, his boots crunching lightly on gravel as he crossed the firing line. Lane 6's target sat 400 yards out, mounted to a steel stand at eye level. He called for a ceasefire on line 2. The other instructors obeyed immediately, the tone in his voice leaving no room for questions. He took the range cart, riding the narrow dirt path toward the target bank. Everyone watched. It took a full minute to reach the marker. When he dismounted and approached, he stood still for several seconds. Then he leaned in, close, checking for any separation, any edge. He didn't find one. 5 .308 rounds had torn through a single spot not wider than a nickel. Dead center in the bullseye. No spread, no vertical drift. He radioed back to the tower. "Group of 5, all through center, same hole, stand by." The cadets barely spoke. Rayner had lowered the scope, staring at nothing. The silence stretched, broken only by a faint breeze tapping against the plywood awning above the range. Maggie stood beside her bench, not smiling, not reacting, just waiting. Mitchell returned at 13:31. When he stepped out of the cart, he didn't look at anyone right away. He faced Maggie, then nodded once. He turned to the group. "That grouping's the cleanest I've seen in 15 years of command-level qualification, and I don't think it came from luck." No one replied. No one laughed. A few cadets shifted their stance, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. Maggie leaned down and began brushing grit off her mat. The rifle lay beside her, bolt open, chamber clear. Nothing flashy, nothing loud. But the silence she left behind spoke louder than any shot fired all day. In the spring of 2012, Maggie flew her 12th sortie in the Helmand province under call sign Talon 6. The air was dry and visibility stretched for miles, but the landscape below told a different story. A SEAL team had gone dark during an extraction mission along the southern edge of the Sangjin Valley. Communications were patchy, the GPS uplink intermittent, and the enemy had maneuvered into dangerously close positions. When the emergency KS request came through, Maggie was already airborne, banking west over the ridgeline in her A-10C Thunderbolt II. At 14:42 local, she dropped from 10,000 feet to 1,500 in a tight spiral, toggling her master arm switch and selecting the 30mm GU-8A Avenger. Her left hand adjusted the throttle, while her right settled on the HOTAS stick. Terrain flashed past the canopy in blur. Her targeting pod confirmed friendlies pinned near an old compound wall, their heat signatures flanked by a half-dozen hostiles moving from tree cover at the edge of a dried canal. Ground control issued a confirmation. Enemies within 60 feet. Danger close. Maggie's voice remained steady as she responded. Visual on friendlies. Acquiring. Run inbound. She didn't ask twice. She already knew the team wouldn't have called unless they had no other option. A miss at that range wouldn't just end the mission, it would take Americans with it. She rolled level at 1,200 feet, hit the laser ranging, and selected the burst limiter. 5-round controlled fire. No more. No less. Her finger settled on the trigger, and she counted her rhythm in her head as the nose pitched down, aligning the pipper over the forward enemy position. The GAU-8 thundered. A-10 recoil jolted her seat, but her grip never wavered. The rounds impacted less than 30 meters ahead of the SEAL team, shredding the advancing fighters and stopping the flanking push. She pulled up hard, climbed back to altitude, circled wide, and waited. 2 seconds later, comms crackled. Hostiles down. Friendlies intact. No injuries. She exhaled. At 14:49, she confirmed secondary coverage and began her RTB to Al Udaid. Back in the ready room, nobody asked for details. Those who flew close air support knew the silence that followed danger close meant you did it right. The debrief was short. The coordinates logged. The kill box cleared. But that day stayed with her. Not because of the kill, but because she saw those boots move once the dust cleared. They lived. She did her job. That was the mission. Precision wasn't a luxury. It was the reason they made it out. And the only souvenir she kept from that sortie wasn't a patch or coin. It was a sharp crease in the flight log, where the coordinates had been written by hand. She never smoothed it out. She didn't need a reminder of what it meant to hit that close without failure. She'd lived it, and she'd never once spoken of it at a shooting range. The day Maggie decided to leave the service wasn't marked by ceremony or medals. It started at 09:07 on a routine training sortie over Laughlin Air Force Base. She was in a T-38 Talon, paired with a junior pilot running flight patterns under mild turbulence. Midway through, descent. The nose gear warning light stayed red. Hydraulic pressure dropped. They cycled the gear 3 times. No response. She took control. At 09:12, she radioed tower and called for emergency gear extension. Manual crank. No time for hesitation. Her co-pilot was silent now, hands gripping the edge of the console. Maggie reached under the panel, flipped the access panel, and began turning. Quarter turns. Elbow. Locked. Breathing even. The crank gave resistance. Then caught. The gear dropped with a jolt that shook the frame. She brought the aircraft down at 09:19 smooth. No bounce. No skidding. Just clean asphalt and a long exhale. Nobody cheered when they parked. Maintenance teams rolled in. Her CO nodded once, but she knew. This one had reached her bones in a way even combat hadn't. Within a month, the papers were filed. Not for disciplinary reasons. Not because she couldn't fly, but because the silence in her head afterward didn't feel like calm anymore. It felt empty. She moved to Wyoming that fall, a cabin near Bridger Teton Forest. No neighbors in sight, just the sound of pine, the low hush of wind against old siding, and a gravel path wide enough to drive into town twice a week. Her name never made local papers. She told no one what she used to do. She built a small bench out back, lined it with sandbags, and set up a paper target at 300 yards. Every morning, she'd take the Remington out of its case, clean the bolt, check the barrel, and load 5 rounds. She never fired more than that. 5 was enough. To her, each shot wasn't practice. It was rhythm, a way to reset the noise, to find stillness through repetition. She never timed herself. She never logged groupings. She didn't need the validation. The target either held the shots tight or it didn't. The rifle didn't lie. That honesty was the only thing she trusted after she took off the flight suit for the last time. She still kept a crate in the corner of the cabin. Inside were her old patches, the Flying Tigers, the 303rd insignia, the laminated flight log with creased corners, a worn challenge coin that hadn't left its pouch in 6 years. She never looked at them unless she had to move the box to clean. Most people who met her in town knew her as the quiet woman who fixed her own truck and never stayed long in line. Some thought she was retired law enforcement. Others guessed a school teacher. Nobody asked twice. And Maggie liked it that way. Because when you've walked away from fire and steel and the weight of being the one they called when everything else failed, silence isn't just comfort. It's survival. And for her, that silence lived best behind a bolt-action rifle. 5 calm breaths, and a stretch of earth where no one needed saving. At 13:33, the sun had shifted just enough to cast a sharper glare across the line of targets. Captain Mitchell stood behind the observation post, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the far end of the range. The groupings were still fresh in his mind. 5 shots. 1 hole. He'd seen expert qualifiers miss that by inches. But Maggie hadn't just made a tight group. She'd eliminated the idea of spread entirely. He replayed every second since she arrived. The quiet, the discipline, the calm. None of it aligned with a casual shooter. Then his eyes caught something, a faded patch, barely visible on the shoulder of her jacket as she leaned to adjust her mat. It was a white tiger over blue and red wings. Not flashy, just worn in. Mitchell blinked, stepped back, and turned toward the main office. Inside, he bypassed the sign-in logs and went straight to the secure terminal. He keyed in a search through the DoD retired personnel registry, limited to former aviation units, using the call sign he hadn't heard in years, Talon 6. He paused for a moment before hitting enter. The result came back in less than a second. Harper, Margaret, Captain, 303rd Air Expeditionary Wing, A-10, Thunderbolt 2, Combat Deployments Afghanistan, Iraq, Decorations Distinguished Flying Cross with Valor, Flight Log Redacted, Medical Discharge Voluntary, no public record of post-service assignments. He read the entry twice, then sat still for a moment. It explained everything. The cadence of her shooting, the silence, the lack of reaction to condescension. She had nothing left to prove. Mitchell stood up and walked out. Slower this time. His boots tapped against the concrete as he made his way back toward the line. The cadets had resumed firing, but the energy had shifted. Quieter, tighter, less chatter. Maggie stood beside her lane, rifle still resting on the bench, bolt open. He stopped 3 paces in front of her. "Ma'am," he said, and the word was not casual this time. "I'd like to apologize. You were under no obligation to explain anything to anyone here, but I believe the record just did it for you." The cadets stopped shooting, one by one. A few turned around, others lowered their rifles, unsure of what they were seeing. Mitchell stepped back, then stood at attention. He raised his right hand in a crisp salute. Maggie looked at him for a long second. She didn't react right away, but there was something in her eyes, soft recognition, maybe a trace of understanding. Then she returned the salute. Her movement was clean, practiced, not showy, just honest. The moment held. Lot. Raynor stood frozen. He glanced at the patch now clearly visible on her arm. His earlier comments hung in the air like fog that refused to clear. A few cadets looked down at their boots. One quietly set his rifle aside. Mitchell turned toward them. Attention on the line. Every cadet stood, rifles down, hands to their sides. The range fell completely silent. He turned back to Maggie. "Captain, the last name's Harper, isn't it?" She nodded once. "Ma'am, it's been a long time since I've read an after-action report that mentioned surgical casts at 60 feet. We used to pass those stories around like ghost tales. Didn't know they were real until about 10 minutes ago." Her expression didn't change, but her voice, when it came, was low and steady. "They weren't ghost tales. We were just told not to talk." Mitchell smiled slightly. "Fair enough." He turned to address the cadets. "I want all of you to remember this moment. What you saw today wasn't luck. It wasn't civilian chance. That was training you don't learn in ROTC. That was what keeps people alive when radios fail and the nearest friendly unit is 20 clicks out." He paused, letting the weight of it settle. Captain Harper provided air support on missions most of you won't read about. Her work made it home so others could too. No one said a word. Mitchell looked back at her one last time. "Ma'am, you're welcome at this range anytime. And if you're willing, I think a few of us would benefit from watching how you work. Maybe even learn something the manuals forgot to print." Maggie didn't smile, but her head tilted just slightly. Not refusal, not agreement, just presence. That was enough. Mitchell nodded again, then stepped aside. And just like that, the range changed. What had started as an ordinary drill became a quiet ceremony. No music, no flag, just a circle of cadets standing still, watching a woman they'd misjudged, now knowing exactly who she was. The air settled like dust after a storm. Most of the cadets remained at parade rest even after Captain Mitchell stepped away. Maggie hadn't said much, and she didn't need to. Her silence had carried more weight than the loudest demonstration. But then, slowly, she walked back toward her bench, picked up a small notebook from her bag, and flipped it open without a word. Mitchell approached again, quieter this time. He waited, then spoke just loud enough for the group to hear. "If you're willing, ma'am, they'd like to learn." He glanced back at the cadets, who stood straighter now. No smirks, no side chatter, just eyes forward. Maggie looked at them, calm but unreadable. She paused for a moment, then spoke. "I'll teach, but only if they're willing to leave their pride at the line." There was no objection, not a single voice. She turned to Rayner, the one who had offered advice just 30 minutes earlier. "Start by showing me your zero, then show me your rest. Then we talk about wind." He nodded once, grabbed his rifle, and stepped up without a word. She knelt beside him, not to correct, but to observe. Then she asked, softly, "Do you know how to listen to your own breath because the rifle hears it before you do?" The cadets began to gather closer, kneeling around the bench. Maggie laid her notebook flat and used her pen to mark angles, holding it sideways to simulate deflection drift. "When the wind moves uphill, your scope won't tell you. The dirt will. The flags will. But only if you're watching the edges. Your eyes should always work a second ahead of your trigger." They scribbled notes. They watched her hands. Mitchell stood back, arms crossed, a faint smile touching his face. This wasn't the kind of training you found in Air Force manuals. This was field knowledge, composure knowledge, the kind that didn't need charts or simulations, just someone who had done it when it mattered. At one point, Maggie picked up Rayner's rifle, shouldered it, then passed it back. "Too much cheek height. Trim your riser. You're losing contact under recoil. That breaks trust with your next shot." Rayner nodded, his voice low now. "Yes, ma'am." The lesson continued for nearly an hour. She taught not just firing posture, but mental discipline. The need to be still before you shoot. The way to read mirage instead of numbers. The weight of choosing to wait one extra second when adrenaline screams otherwise. At 15:04, the first shot of the next round rang out. This time, it came from Rayner's lane. It struck the center. Not perfect, but closer than before. Maggie didn't praise or critique. She just nodded. Again. And he did. Behind them, the cadets stayed lined up, waiting their turn, listening closely. Not because they were told to, but because they knew they were hearing something rare. A lesson that didn't come from titles or rank. It came from someone who had earned every word in silence. And when the lesson ended, they didn't ask for stories. They didn't ask for medals or proof. They just asked when she'd be back. By the time the final, carefully placed round was fired, and its report had faded into the vastness of the landscape, the sun had already commenced its slow, majestic drift toward the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold as it prepared to dip behind the imposing silhouette of the distant ridge, with a meticulous, almost reverent, quiet precision that mirrored the very same movements she had used to unpack it hours earlier. Maggie began the process of packing her well-maintained rifle. There were no grand announcements to signal her departure, no formal farewells exchanged with the now silent group of onlookers. She simply and efficiently zipped the soft rifle case closed, slung its strap securely over her shoulder, and in a final, understated gesture, offered Captain Mitchell a brief, yet profoundly meaningful, short nod of acknowledgement. He instinctively understood the nature of this silent communication. He didn't make any move to stop her or engage in unnecessary conversation. He just returned the gesture with an identical nod of his own, a silent acknowledgement that any spoken words would have felt hollow and entirely out of place in the weighted atmosphere of that moment. Before she turned to walk away completely, she placed a small, unassuming box on the worn surface of the concrete bench, leaving it there as she walked off toward the gravel path leading away from the range. It was left without any accompanying note or verbal explanation, a silent testament to the day's events. Inside, nestled against a simple foam backing, rested a single heavy coin with a matte black finish that seemed to absorb the fading light. One side of the coin was engraved with the unmistakable insignia of the Flying Tigers, a symbol of legendary prowess and courage in the air. On the reverse side, a short, powerful phrase was meticulously etched in clean, unadorned block lettering that conveyed its message with stark clarity: for those who protect without needing to be seen. Captain Mitchell refrained from opening the box immediately, choosing instead to wait until the last of the cadets had dutifully cleared the line, their movements now more deliberate and thoughtful than they had been all day. He waited until the metallic echoes of that transformative afternoon had completely faded from the firing bays, leaving only the sound of the gentle evening breeze. When he finally permitted himself to hold the coin in his palm, he was struck by the palpable weight of it, a weight that felt as if it came not merely from the dense alloy of its metal, but from the profound depth of its unspoken meaning and the history it represented. 3 full days later, in a quiet act of his own, he personally mounted a modest plaque on the wall directly behind Lane 6. It wasn't large or ostentatious, but rather a small, humble bronze square set securely into the rough concrete wall, intended not for widespread recognition but for personal reflection. The inscription was simple and direct, capturing the essence of the lesson they had all learned in honor of quiet precision. Let skill, not appearance, define respect. No formal ceremony marked its quiet placement in the days that followed. No official photographs were taken to commemorate the occasion, and no mention was made of it in any base-wide communications. Yet, every single cadet who passed by it in the days and weeks that followed understood with absolute clarity exactly why it was there, its message resonating deeply with their recent experience. It was Lieutenant Rayner who became the first to verbally articulate the lingering lesson from that day, several weeks later, in the middle of a routine peer review session that was assessing the unit's recent performance. He suddenly paused mid-sentence, the words trailing off as a look of deep introspection crossed his face. "We never even bothered to ask her where she had learned to shoot with such mastery," he admitted, his voice low and tinged with the memory of his own prior arrogance. "We just assumed." Captain Mitchell allowed the profound silence that followed the lieutenant's admission to sit in the room for a long moment, letting its significance settle upon everyone present before he finally offered his reply, his voice calm and steady. "That, Lieutenant, is the fundamental lesson here," he stated, making eye contact with each of the young officers in training. Never make the mistake of assuming that true, profound skill requires a uniform to be considered real. The entire culture among the cadets perceptibly changed after that transformative afternoon, a tangible shift in their collective demeanor that was noticed by all of their instructors. There was significantly less idle noise and boastful chatter during the critical preparation phases on the range. A much higher degree of focused discipline became the new standard on the firing line. They began to adjust their cheek welds and shooting rests with a quiet diligence, often without ever being told to do so. They took longer, more considered moments to break their shots, meticulously checking their breathing, the subtle shifts in the wind, and their own posture before gently squeezing the trigger. And whenever they saw other civilians using the range in the future, they looked closer, looking less for the brand of their equipment or the flashiness of their gear, and more for the quiet, understated signs of genuine experience. Her name was never once printed in an official base bulletin or mentioned in a formal report. The challenge coin she had left behind was never entered into any kind of official inventory, instead remaining in Captain Mitchell's personal possession as a private reminder. But her indelible mark stayed, permanently etched into the very fabric of the unit. It lived on not just in demonstrably improved bullet groupings on paper targets or in new phrases repeated during tactical drills. It lived most powerfully in the quieter, more respectful tone that permeated every subsequent training session. It resided in the newfound patience they exhibited, It was clearly visible in the humble and professional way those cadets carried themselves long after that day, once they had finally and fully understood what quiet, unassuming mastery truly looked like. Maggie Harper never returned to the Sierra Valley shooting complex. In the end, she didn't need to. Her powerful, silent legacy had already taken firm root, quietly flourishing in the still, respectful corners of a range where respect was once casually measured in rank and insignia, but was now, and forevermore, traced in the profound language of silence and steel.